months after Sophie died. I hit a wall and I had a very traumatic, emotional experience with my wife, and I just said, I need to see somebody, and I made that conscious decision that it was time. I could no longer, balance everything in my head and not seek help. Right. So with some of the tricks that my therapist taught me, support system between my Army family, my wife, and my extended family. My main thing is you'd have to allow yourself to feel it. You know what I mean? I think that's the first thing that I do. Allow yourself to feel it, but try not to dwell on it, because you start dwelling on it, you start getting into the depression and the loneliness and everything. So what I try to think of is, what would Sophie want from me?
Welcome to the Growth and Thriving podcast, where we celebrate the lives of people who have overcome great adversity and examine the tools and techniques by which people grow and create lives that feel like thriving. I'm your host, Dr. Jerry Sunshine Novak, and I'm really excited to have you with me today, because today we're talking to a friend of mine who is a husband, a father, a lifelong soldier, or not a lifelong, but a career soldier in the U.S. Army. A badass grappler, both in wrestling and Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. And like I said, a really decent human and good friend. Please welcome Ruben Gonzalez.
How you doing, Jerry?
What's going on, man? So what we normally do, Ruben, is I normally have people, I gave a brief introduction. Why don't you just talk a little bit about, some of the things you have in your life and how you got here from wherever you like.
All right.
Or whatever, and tell us.
Yeah. So I've been in almost 20 years. Next month will be 20-year mark, March 14th. Oh, first off, I need to say happy birthday to my lovely wife, Becca. She deserves that. So happy birthday, baby. So 20 years next month. So it's been a long journey. 4 deployments. 2 of those were combat tours early on in the Operation Iraqi Freedom, and then get some mental scar tissue build up from that. You get some PTSD, some wounds from friends passing and whatnot. And then I have my 2 other deployments, one to Europe, one to Kuwait, and still, time away from home, stuff like that. So it's been a long, I always call it my crazy effed up adventure. That's what I call my life, one crazy effed up adventure.
And you can curse on this podcast, just
okay.
Because I have to, right? Right. How I talk. I can't.
Yeah. So yeah, it's one crazy fucked up adventure. That's what I would definitely call my life. But it's been an adventure. But I'm going to highlight something more about a recent trauma of mine. But give a little background. About 6 or 7 years ago, my wife and I split. She, we agreed that she would get full-time custody of the kids with visitation whenever I wanted. So that left me kind of alone, empty nest syndrome for a while, bouncing around from place to place between deployments. Even brought me to live with you for a little bit, which is how we became so close, and then became you such a good friend to me. But about now, it was mid 2017. I was deployed to Europe, and it was Hungary. I believe it was in Hungary at the time. I got a call from my ex-wife saying that my daughter had to go to the hospital. My daughter, Sophia, she had to go to the hospital. She was visiting my mother in Arkansas at the time. And so they originally had a stomach ache. Originally, they thought it might be her appendix, maybe a blockage or 2. They weren't sure. They were hoping for the best, but they were taking all precautions. They ruled out the appendix, but there was still pain. And one day my mom called me and she just gave me the bad news up front. She said, Sophia has cancer. It was confirmed that my 9-year-old little girl had cancer. The worst news that any parent could ever imagine is to find out your child has cancer. Of course, I didn't process it very well, and it took me a little while to kind of gather my bearings. The Army, of course, they acted quickly. My command got me home. I was home within 48 hours from Europe, which, if you know about military bureaucracy, that's a feat in itself to get someone 48 hours.
You can't buy a pencil in 48 hours.
Right.
Military.
You're still trying to get it up through the levels to get approval.
Right.
But so it was a pretty minor miracle that they got me through. So they flew me to Little Rock, where my daughter and my mom were. Her mom was driving down from Wisconsin and was going to meet me there. And so when we talked to them, they confirmed it was cancer. They weren't sure what it was yet because they still had to do genetic testing on it. But they knew she had to get to back home and get on a treatment protocol quickly, because they were afraid that it was pretty aggressive, just based on the size of the tumor, which was about the size of my fist, and it was kind of wrapped around her uterus area. So we go home and we find out we go to her home. I wasn't living there at the time. Go to her home. And we go to University of Minnesota Masonic Children's Hospital, and they do all the genetic testing. They come back and they say she has a form of cancer called alveolar rhabdomyosarcoma. It's a mouthful, but it's a very rare form of bone and tissue cancer that can spread in any soft tissue in your body. It can spread to. So you can imagine how much soft tissue you actually have inside your body. It's a nasty one. And we found out that literally 1 in a million children actually get this type of cancer. And originally they gave her 33% chance of living in the first year. And any parent they'll take 33% and they'll take a fight. It could have been much worse at that point. So she went on her chemo treatment, and chemo was it was working well for her. She was getting sick. She lost her hair. But about 8-9 months later, we found out that her tumor shrunk. So it was gone. And it was just like out of nowhere. It was just gone. It was amazing. The doctors were amazed that it reacted so fast. So she was technically in, it's called NED, no evidence of disease, and she was in remission, excuse me.
Remission.
And so things were going well for about a year. She was doing fine, grew her hair back. She looked like she was going to be able to have her life again. And I was actually on a second deployment at that point. It was about a year and a half, maybe later. I was on the second deployment at that time. Just coming home and visiting them for my time off after deployment. And she has to go to the hospital again. She's having, 3 or 4 times a night, she's throwing up, she's having pain. And finally they said, okay, so they did scans, and we were up at the Minnesota hospital again, and find out that it's back. She has cancer again, and it's in virtually the same spot. So it was very aggressive this time. It was much more aggressive than it was last time. It was spreading. And so what the protocol was, we all decided to do was to remove her bladder and her uterus. So she had a full hysterectomy at age 12, excuse me. Yeah, so at age 12, she had a full hysterectomy, and her bladder was gone. So they had to take it out. And this was a last-ditch effort because the cancer was spreading fast. And so she basically was in and out of hospitals the next 3 months. This was in, I want to say, September, October time. If I get the timelines wrong, excuse me, it's over 3.5 years, all this stuff's happening. But early December, her mother and I got called her mother was already there. So I got called up to the hospital, and the doctors pulled us in, and they said that the last scans revealed that her cancer had spread all throughout her lungs. She had so many tumors in her lungs that there was too many to count. They said it was multiple, it was too many they could actually physically count. It was, so it was spreading throughout her lungs and then also down in her lower area again. And so what they told us at that point, they said there's nothing more that they can do for her.
Mm.
So she had to be told that she's going home on hospice, and she was more than likely going to die. So, she cried, I don't want to die, don't let me die. And it was probably the most heartbreaking thing I'd ever had to hear and endure. And her mother had to endure it more because she lived with her, of course. So got her home and basically set her up on hospice. And so her mother and stepfather took care of her on a daily basis while I came back to home and had to, figure out the logistics of getting up there and staying up there and everything. So when they brought the nurses in, day and night, her mother and her stepfather were taking care of her, and I would come and stay from early morning to late at night. I would go to a local hotel, and it was just this thing we did. And then she made it to Christmas. So we got a Christmas Eve with her, and her mom got Christmas with her. But it was shortly after the night of Christmas where her body was deteriorating to the point so badly where they had to basically up her medication. And it wasn't a coma so much, it was just a medically induced sleep. Mm-hmm. And they just said it was a matter of time before her body just said no. And so the 26th went by, and then on the morning of December 27th of 2020, she took her last breath. Mm. So it's been rough.
Wow. Yeah. As a parent, I can't even imagine. And I don't say that lightly because so I lost a very close loved one to cancer as well. When I was 7 years old, my mother died from cancer. She was 34, I was 7. And throughout most of my life, I would adamantly argue that being 7 years old, and my mother, not that different from Sophie, went through 4 years of battling illness, of losing her hair, of in and out of the hospital, all kinds of atrocities. And I would have argued that watching her deteriorate and die over the course of 4 years when I was 7, I mean, she got sick when I was 3 or 4 and then died when I was 7, was maybe the worst, most painful thing I could ever imagine. And so through a lot of my life, I actually had a hard time with empathy because people would complain about things that upset them or hurt them, and by comparison, it just seemed like nothing to me until I had children, right? Because even though going through what I've gone through in the pain of watching my mother die when I was young, I think watching anything happen to my children would be worse. And so I couldn't even imagine. But what I do sort of know, because you're wearing your Sophie's Warrior shirt, and yeah. I actually feel silly now because I'm not wearing, I have a Fight with Sophie shirt that I'm not wearing. But you gave highlights of like the primary things that happened, but you guys had a Facebook group for Sophie's Warriors where, I mean, you raised some funds and things to help with medical expenses, but also sort of detailed her day-to-day life. And so while it sounds like, well, she went in and got diagnosed and then had treatment and then got better and then got sick again, it was really much more complicated than that day to day. There were good, there were bad days. There was in and out of the hospital. There was a lot of sort of day to day ups and downs.
Correct.
Going on that we got to see from being a part of the Facebook group. And there's just two things that I wanted to highlight, and I want to highlight them because I think you're probably too humble to bring them up. But I also hope that maybe you could address them and talk about them a little bit. The first is, you mentioned that you bounced around a lot and ended up staying with me for a little while as part of that. But that's not really the whole story as I understand it. You know, the whole story is that you didn't have a home in Colorado Springs when you were at Fort Carson up here. You didn't rent a house or an apartment because you were sending every dollar you could home to your ex-wife.
I was sending a lot of extra money to help out with whatever I could.
Right. And so instead of having a home, instead of having a place to live, you would I mean, you were deployed for like more than a year at a time, but then you would be home, and you would be home in Colorado Springs, either find somebody who had a room to rent, because the, you know, apartments are very expensive here. And so you would either rent something really cheap, or when you stayed with me, there was no rent, so
Right.
that you could, but, you know, and I mean, that sounds great. Like, you lived rent free, but you had a room in my house. I mean, you know, you spent as a grown adult, right? And a non-commissioned officer in the US Army, you lived in a single bedroom in my house, in order to send as much money as you could home to help your ex-wife take care of Sophie. And I think, you know, to me, that's pretty remarkable. That's a lot of sacrifice to be a grown man and live in a bedroom in somebody's house.
I think it was something I didn't even think twice about. It was something I was willing to do and willing to make. So, you know, I've always felt like I could have done more, but there's, you know, after the fact, you have so many regrets and so many coulda, shouldas, you know, but that was just something that I felt like I could do. So,
Yeah. The other piece that stands out in my memory, because you were living in my house, I got to, you know, there were times when you'd be maybe in the kitchen or something, and on the phone. And I remember overhearing one conversation that you had with Sophie, where, if we, you know, a few minutes ago, we said she was in and out of the hospital a lot, right? It wasn't as simple as,
yeah.
well, she got sick, she got better, and then she got sick again.
Right.
In and out of the hospital a lot, which I imagine is really tough for a child, right? I mean, it's tough for an adult. So I can only imagine for a young person. And I guess on one particular day, she had to have some treatments or tests or something that were uncomfortable, maybe being pricked with needles and such. And I don't really know, I just kind of overheard some of it because we were in the same room in the house, and she must have been kind of snotty, I guess, with the doctors and maybe with your ex-wife, with her mom. And I remember you addressing her behavior. And I was trying to put myself in your shoes of having a child who was so sick that her life was on the line, was threatened, but still having to parent, right? You can't ignore bad behavior.
Correct.
Right. And I was so impressed with how you managed to strike a balance between compassion and understanding for what she was going through, which you expressed to her, right? Like, it was clear you had compassion and empathy for what she was going through, and still establish the boundary with her about what was acceptable and what wasn't, and how she treated other people. And as somebody who is a parent, as somebody who wrote a doctoral dissertation for my PhD, I wrote my dissertation on fatherhood. I run a fatherhood group on Facebook. I was so impressed by that conversation that it's years later and it still is very fresh in my mind.
Wow. Yeah, I honestly couldn't even recall that conversation, but yeah, it was hard because you want your child to be able to express her discomfort and not discount what she's going through, but she had to know that they weren't there to hurt her. They weren't her enemy. And they were the ones that were trying to save her life. So she needed to be aware of that and to treat them as such. So it was something that it was just reactionary really, more than anything, so I appreciate you saying that, so that hopefully that's good telling sign about, you know, my techniques, I guess.
Well, and to me, I guess the other piece that sort of jumped out, the piece that stays with me is my assumption, and unfortunately we'll never know because Sophie's not here to speak on it, but my assumption is that it imparted a bit of normalcy into her life, right? So much of her life for a 9-year-old, a 10-year-old, an 11-year-old was abnormal. And to me, there's like nothing more normal than a parent correcting you when you've had an attitude with your mom and the doctors.
Right.
Right. And I think in her situation, it could have been very easy to just overlook it because of what she's going through. But I've got to believe, I would bet good money that on some level, it felt good to her to be corrected and treated like a normal kid.
Yeah, that was one chief, I won't say complaint, but something she vocalized a lot is that she wants to have a normal life. She just wanted to be a normal kid. Why can't she be normal? Why'd God give this to her? And any sense of normalcy we could ever give her on multiple occasions, we would. So I think that would stand to reason that would fall in line with that, the normalcy of what she wanted. So
yeah. I try to put myself in your shoes a lot. And I don't know how I would react trying to parent a child who was in that sort of a predicament.
Right. Because it would have been very easy to just let her go about it and just excuse it.
Right.
As she's let her whatever. But it was important to me for her to understand that at that point we were still, under the assumption she was going to live. Yeah. So, you have to be a good human being.
So, what other assumption could you have, right? I mean,
right. No, yeah, no. You until the day they told me she was going on hospice, I was full bore, we're going to pull through this. Yeah.
And then I try to imagine going into work every day in the U.S. Army, and correct me if I'm wrong, but you're in the infantry, no?
Oh, no. I've been in infantry units. I've been in cav units. I'm a mechanic.
Oh, mechanic. Okay. Well,
but I was in the infantry division.
Okay. Right. And mechanic is one of those career fields. So when I was in the military, I was a medic, right? I was a psychologist.
Right.
And so if we got deployed, we were still non-combatants, right? We still stayed on the FOB. We were in the mental health clinic, and we would carry weapons, but we were only allowed to engage if we were protecting ourselves or our patients. So as long as the enemy didn't breach the FOB and didn't come into the mental health clinic, we never fired a weapon, right? We never engaged. Mechanic is one of those career fields where you get tapped like, hey, come on this convoy. Mm-hmm. You're a combatant. Yeah.
During my second tour, that's basically what we were. We would do mechanics, but if we needed us for convoys for security, you're going.
Right. And so I'm trying to imagine having this situation going on at home and going into work.
Yeah.
And the reason it's important is because regardless of how you feel about the wars in Iraq or Afghanistan, regardless of people's political affiliations, regardless of any of that, if you're cooking, if you're flipping burgers at McDonald's and you're a little bit careless in your job, the consequences are much smaller. If you're a greeter at Walmart or you work at Target or something, the consequences of having an off day are much smaller than having an off day when you're on a combat deployment.
Correct. And there's also twofold to that too, is the level that I had reached professionally. I was a senior leader.
Right.
I'm a senior leader in the military, and I was a platoon sergeant at the time. So not only do I have my own career in my hands, I have the career of 92 other people to guide them and make sure they're taken care of. So my personal needs and wants were always put on the back burner to ensure that I wasn't neglecting them
Right.
as well. So, that was probably the balance was on professionally versus personally was probably the hardest thing for me,
Wow.
which in the military, they teach you to compartmentalize, and that really put to the test my ability to compartmentalize
Yeah.
things.
I don't have a hard time imagining you, just because of how I know you. I don't have a hard time imagining you putting other people's needs ahead of your own. That seems to me like something you do very naturally. What's harder for me is I'm trying to imagine you having troops who are your subordinates, right? Who you're in charge of, who are having whatever problems they're having at home and needing to talk about it, needing some accommodations made, needing something from you. And again, like comparison, right, is like the root of disaster, right? As soon as we start comparing ourselves to other people in any kind of way, it's usually disastrous. But I'm trying to imagine, some soldier coming to me talking about having maybe marital difficulties at home, right? And needing some help or some counsel or some sort of services or accommodation, and feeling, trying to help this person and take their difficulties really seriously, even though it feels really small compared to what I'm going through.
Fortunately, I earlier in my career when I was a staff sergeant, I worked in a unit called the Warrior Transition Unit.
Oh yeah.
It's
Mhm.
you know about that. It's the Army's unit where they send wounded and injured soldiers to rehabilitate that they have complex medical care issues. And I had a level of empathy just growing up. I think I'm a very empathetic person by nature. But what that job taught me to do was to look at every single problem like it's your own problem. When how would you feel if you needed this done? What would you want done? How personal it is for you if that was you. So that job really it helped me grasp more of a personal relationship with soldiers and the problems that they're going through. So I think that really helped me put the mindset of when a soldier comes to you, for one, they're trusting you
Right.
with that problem, hoping that you'll take care of it, and two, that it's your job to look at that problem like, if that were you, how would you want that treated? And in the moment, that's the biggest thing going on in their life.
Yeah.
So just because in comparison to your tragedy or your struggle, don't project that onto them, because they have their own struggle and that's what's important right now.
Yeah.
So fix that, and then you can,
What I can tell you from my experience, Ruben, is that lots of people get that kind of training, and so many of them still fucking suck at it. There's something about the character of somebody, and you're one of these people who can do that, right? Who can put their personal suffering aside and treat somebody else's issue as though it's their own, you know. So one of the things that's interesting to me, and maybe you can talk about this a little bit, is so you have, you already said, you talked, mentioned it and kind of moved on quickly, but there's grief from friends and colleagues who are lost in combat. There's trauma from combat experiences, and maybe from other areas of your life too. I mean, people have trauma outside the military too. So there's trauma. I'm certain that there's both trauma and grief related to this years-long situation with Sophie's health and her death. And for all the news and all the things we hear about soldiers with PTSD, right? And violence and domestic violence and alcohol use problems and drug problems and, you know, arrests and all these kinds of things, you still manage to be a responsible husband, a loving father, have a successful career, still active duty in the Army without any issues. I'm wondering what kinds of things you do, what practices you have, how you take care of yourself in your day-to-day life that helps you, you know, manage and thrive despite having these accumulating struggles.
First, I have to give a lot of credit to my wife. She lost a child, I want to say 17 years ago, when we obviously weren't together. When he was 2 years old. So she had her own personal trauma and her own grieving process, and she knew what to expect. So every single time it would be a point where you know, I needed to hear something or didn't need to hear something, or however, whatever she needed to be for me, she was, because she knew what I needed already before I even knew that I needed it, you know? And the biggest thing for me, at first it was hard. It was hard because when you're in the military, you know, you're taught to put it in your rucksack and keep moving. You know what I mean? Tuck that away, because that's not going to help you doing your job. You can't feel, because the feeling is you know, a liability, you
Right.
know, because you have to, you know, project this air of confidence and toughness and you know, whatever. So at first that's what I was trying to do. I didn't want to see a counselor. I didn't want to you know, talk about it. I was like, I'm just gonna push through it like I always have my entire life. All the traumas that I've gone through, you know, just barrel through them, you know. And about, I'd say 3 months in, I hit a wall. And
3 months to what, Ruben?
After Sophie died.
After Sophie died, okay.
3 months after Sophie died, I hit a wall, and you know, I had a very traumatic, emotional experience with my wife, and I just said, I need to see somebody, you know. And I made that conscious decision that it was time. I could no longer, you know, balance everything in my head and not seek help.
Right.
So with some of the tricks that my therapist taught me, support system between my Army family, my wife, and my extended family. You know, my main thing is you'd have to allow yourself to feel it. You know what I mean? I think that's the first thing that I do. Allow yourself to feel it, but try not to dwell on it, because, you know, you start dwelling on it, you start getting into the depression and the loneliness and everything. So what I try to think of is, what would Sophie want from me? You know, what would she want me to be happy, or she want me to be sad and crying over her all the time? You know, and so when I get down or sad, I'd allow myself to cry. I'd allow myself to feel. But then, you know, I heard that little voice, you know, saying, "Okay, Daddy, you know, it's time.
Yeah.
Time to get up." And fortunately, she made me this this Baby Yoda is our thing between me and her. The Baby Yoda, that's like our mascot, memorial mascot, I guess you'd say. So I collect all things Baby Yoda. Well, my wife got a voice box of Sophie to record little. Excuse me, I got up early for PT this morning. A little voice box recording, and it's a personal recording between her and me. But basically, it says, you know, anytime you miss me, just look up, and I'm watching over you.
Yeah.
And every time I need that, I listen to that, and I squeeze it, and I listen to it. You know, I used to cry myself to sleep every night, you know, and because the day would be me trying to white knuckle through the day.
Yeah.
I would just, after my wife would fall asleep, I'd cry for an hour, just, you know, for no reason, not for no reason, but just out of no. But I think the biggest thing that I do is I allow myself to feel, but I don't dwell. I think is my biggest thing, because I always tell my wife I can feel the darkness coming back. You know, the darkness is creeping in, and that's just my metaphor for the sadness that it can consume me. You know,
Yeah.
consume me for a long time, for the first, like I said, the first 3 months. And so when I tell her that, you know, we talk, and you know, I see a therapist regularly now, and I've developed this mechanism of you know, allowing myself to feel but don't dwell, and then just start searching for you know, positivity, you know, and the good things in my life, and you know, and then I try and think of the memories of Sophie, the good times we had, and the smiling faces, and even though she's not here anymore, you know, her memory is everywhere, you know. So I think that's best I can really articulate it.
Yeah.
I think.
What's really hitting me, what seems important to me, in my role as somebody who, like, I mean, this is a role I chose for myself. It wasn't given to me, but I do this podcast and I write a blog and I have these face group communities, and I do them for the purpose of conveying information to folks, you know, about, you know, my goal is really two things. One is to make the information accessible, because not everybody has access to a therapist. If they don't have
Right.
health insurance, it's expensive, you know, and so that's why the content that I put out is always free, because
Right.
I want it to be accessible. But the other piece to me that's really important, and I think you're doing a brilliant job without even trying, of just demonstrating this, is showing people what the reality of it looks like. When we talk about things like post-traumatic growth or growth and thriving, we talk about things like a gratitude practice, or like self-compassion, or a growth mindset. It's very easy in the course of the discussion, or even in an academic setting, to get the sense that it's all sort of like rainbows and unicorns, right? It's
Right.
all sunshine and beauty. And I think the reality of it is that it's not. I think, in fact, I would say that the folks who do roll up their sleeves and learn, oh, the other one is vulnerability, right? In order to have had this wall that you hit 3 months in with Becca, you had to be vulnerable with her. You had to let her see it, right? Going to therapy required vulnerability. It required allowing yourself to be seen, right? Without armor on, without sucking it up, so to speak, right? And don't get me wrong, I really believe there's a time and a place to suck it up, right? You said in the military, you stuff it in your rucksack, right? Well, when you're out on a march, there's a lot of stuff in your rucksack that you don't pull out because it would get in the way of the march, right? But when you get to your destination, then yes, you take your rucksack off and you pull all that shit out and you go through it and you see what you need and what you don't. And so emotionally, I think it's the same, right? Like if you have to function, if you have to do something, then yeah, you stuff it in your rucksack. But at some point, you got to empty that rucksack out and examine it. And in my experience, both professionally as a therapist, in the military, in the civilian world, doesn't matter, and in my personal experience in my life, the folks who realize that they need to work on self-compassion, that they need to establish a gratitude practice, that they need to establish a mindfulness practice, that they need to work on developing a growth mindset, are the least sort of like sunshine and rainbows and kind of people. They're the grittiest, right? The grittiest people. They're grittier than the people who are just sucking it up, to me, you know, because like you said, that darkness creeps in. And instead of pretending it's not there, instead of trying to act like it's not there, these are the people who roll up their sleeves and say, yeah, it's there, man. There's awful, awful feelings, awful thoughts, haunting memories, and all kinds of darkness that if I allow it to dictate my life, it's actually dishonoring Sophie's memory or my mother's memory more than if I learn how to let it come, let it go, and press on in a way that honors their memory.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So I, she was so adamant about people not being sad around her and crying around her, especially when she was in her hospice. They did a really good job. They set up the living room as the hospice area, and they put a curtain so she could just have her space. But she said, if you're going to cry, I don't want you in here. Mm-hmm. Because she was very blunt, very honest young lady. She said, if I'm going to die, I'm going to die with as many happy memories as I can. And it was just amazing to see this young woman process all of this at such a young age. But it just kind of made you realize, well, if she's crying over it, then you need to figure out a way to be happy, And so, like you said, the ones that are grittier, figure that out. The ones that don't, like you said, we've been saying, they stuff it in the rucksack and keep going. But eventually that rucksack will get too full, and you got to figure it out. Get too heavy for you, and you're just going to crumble.
Yeah, so. I think the important piece for people to recognize is that when you talk about you got to be happy, right? You got to figure out how to be happy. What that looks like in real life is not exactly what it sounds like, right? Sometimes that happiness is a fucking fight. Sometimes it's a struggle, and the simple but difficult, right? It's not complicated, but it's hard. Truth is that at any given point in our life, even when a parent or a child has just died, if we were to hit the pause button and as objectively as possible examine all of the facts of our life in that moment, there are absolutely reasons to be miserable. There are absolutely reasons to be sad, to be resentful, to be angry. And at the same time, at the identical moment, there's also almost, definitely always, not almost, there's always a handful of reasons to be grateful. There's a handful of reasons. What is that?
Hunt the good stuff. That's what they teach us in resiliency class.
Yes, right. And so the idea is not that you ignore the stuff that's upsetting you. You can't ignore the loss of your baby girl. You can't ignore the loss of a parent. You can't ignore marital difficulties. You can't ignore mental health difficulties. The idea is that you acknowledge that all of this exists, and you choose to give what you said, the good stuff, if you will, more power in your life, more influence. And so it's a gritty, dirty process, and so my concern is that people not think that it all looks like sunshine and rainbows all the time.
Oh no, when I speak of happiness, that could be as little as being able to get through the day without crying.
Yeah.
That could be being able to just function, being able to, because I had the worst problem with focus for those first 3 months. I could not focus on anything. I couldn't, if I read something, I couldn't repeat back to you 3 facts in that paragraph of what, and it was affecting my work. It was affecting my home life. And so, the happiness, if you will, or just taking the win for the day would be so much as to just get through the day functional. And, and it's not even if you're not crying, it's just being able to take some positive from that, being able to look at that day and be like, nothing bad happened today. So that's a win. Yeah. So, or if it did happen, how did you respond to it? Did you respond to it positively? Did you respond to it negatively? Right. So the happiness, really, that's just kind of like a catch-all for positivity,
Right.
positive reinforcement of your daily life and your actions in that daily life, as opposed to just negatively handling everything. So it doesn't have to be laughing and joking and giggling so much as it's just finding positivity.
Yeah.
Really.
Yeah. And I think, like you said, like getting through a day where maybe in the course of the day, for the first time in a long time, you didn't feel the need to cry is a win, right?
Absolutely.
It's also a win, I think, to get partially through the day, realize that there's something coming up and there's a need to cry, crying it out and realizing it didn't debilitate you. You can clean yourself up and march on,
And I've had quite a few of those days since my realization.
Yeah.
That's been a pretty regular practice for me. I would say at least a couple times a week.
Yeah.
But
That's a win too,
yeah, like you said, it doesn't have to cripple your whole day.
Yeah.
So a few times it has.
Right.
Don't get me wrong. A few times I've had to go to my boss and be like, look, I can't be here. I just need to go. And okay, cool. But for the most part, when you get into the habit of processing why you cried and allowing it not to be a boomerang and just keep coming back to you, then it gets easier to get through that.
Yeah.
And then you get to the point where you're not crying so much. And some people look at like me at first, I was like, am I forgetting my little girl? Am I not sad enough? Should I be crying more? Should I be happy? Am I allowed to be happy?
Right.
But then I go back to what she said is, be happy around me.
Yeah.
So if she wanted me happy around her, she sure as heck wanted me happy now.
Yeah.
So she was a big inspiration towards the end of her life. I mean, her whole life, but towards the end of her life specifically, how she handled her situation. Most adults would be embarrassed in comparison to this child who would just look him in the eye and laugh at him like, are you kidding me?
Yeah.
So it really, I took bits and pieces of her fight and tried to apply them to, well, what would Sophie do? And she would cry, but she'd let the needle stick her. And then guess what? A few minutes later, she'd be okay.
Yeah.
So it's kind of, in retrospect, she did all this stuff to show us how, show me how to handle stuff. And I just have to, pay attention and learn. And it's like a jigsaw puzzle. How do you piece it all together?
It's almost like she knew her time was short and she had to be the example.
Mm-hmm.
And isn't it an interesting thought that we have? Like, is it okay? Am I allowed to be happy? Right. Am I not honoring her enough? You said, am I not sad enough? Right. And what strikes me is like, I'm familiar with that. Like that, I've had that too. And I know that that's real. And then there's a part inside of me that also knows that allowing the sadness to take over is the easy way out.
Absolutely.
Right?
Absolutely.
It requires much more. Your shirt says Sophie's Warriors. It requires a warrior to fight back the sad, or not fight it back, but to allow it to come and allow it to go and find reasons to thrive anyway.
It's easy to allow it to consume you. It's easy to allow it to just wash over you and you just lay there in your bed and just allow the pain to just control you. Feel it, yes, but for when it starts controlling you, which like it did for me my first few months, it'll cripple you. Yeah. Literally cripple you to the point where it was crippling me. It was crippling my mind. Yeah. I couldn't focus. I had bad dreams. I'd be, crying every night. And I wasn't crying for the right reasons to try and let it process. I was crying because I was letting it overwhelm me. Right. And once I was done crying, I wasn't doing the whole bounce back thing. It was just cry, keep being sad, go to bed. And it was a vicious cycle that I was stuck in for a long time. And my wife, she was trying to help me out of it. But once I started seeing therapy, her efforts were much better received because I was being basically told, you know, how to, reminded of the tools that I already knew
Right.
that I just wasn't implementing because I didn't want to. You know, I
Right.
was so set against help.
Right.
I could do it on my own, you know, and I realized that I couldn't, and you can't, nobody can.
And it's a funny thought, right? Like that I can do it on my own because in any other circumstance, right, at work or around your house or in any other circumstance, you would never refuse to use the resources that were available, right? That picture that's hanging up behind you, right? If you had to put a nail in the wall to hang that picture and I was handing you a hammer, you would never say, no way, I'm going to put this in with my finger because
Right.
it's weakness to use a hammer, right? No, the hammer's a resource. Of course you would use it, right? It's silly. If you have to go to the supermarket and the supermarket is 5 miles from your home, you would absolutely get in the car, right? There's no reason you would be like, no, it's weakness to use the car. I'm walking to the supermarket. Right? Every other area, we have no problem using resources. But when it comes to this sort of thing with the personal vulnerability and our emotions, for some reason that becomes, in our mind, becomes weakness. And it's like, no, I have to do it without these resources. And the truth is, it just works better if you use the resources, if the resources are the right ones anyway. Yeah. Yeah.
Absolutely.
I wish I can remember, growing up as a kid who lost his mom at a young age. And I grew up in a household that was not terribly nurturing for that kind of thing. I grew up in a household where there's a lot of violence and a lot of yelling and a lot of not tons of nurturing or compassion and warmth. And so I was kind of an angry kid. And at some point, I'm going to say I had this realization. I'm pretty sure that somebody said this to me, and I don't remember who, but I'm pretty confident that I'm not smart enough to have just come up with it on my own. So, but as a kid, as an adolescent and a young adult in my early 20s, I made a lot of really bad decisions with my life because I was angry and because I was emotional and because I had all this repressed grief and sadness that I refused to deal with. And I acted out a lot and I made some bad decisions. And I thought that I was justified in those decisions because of what I'd been through. And somewhere along the line, I had the realization, probably because someone said it to me, that the things I had been through could either be the reason why I never get my life on track, or they could be the reason why I have to. And it was like the lights were turned on.
Right.
That's kind of super clearly at that point. And it was like, right, what I've been through can be the reason why I have to live a certain kind of way, to honor my mother's memory, to help other people who are struggling,
It's funny you say that because I attribute being the father that I am to not having a father.
Right.
I didn't have a father. He was gone when I was 3 months old, I think, or something. I don't have any logged memories of him in my head. And my whole mantra of growing up was, when I become a father, I have to be everything that he wasn't.
Yeah.
And because he was nothing, the opposite of nothing is everything.
Right.
So I had to be everything.
Yeah.
So I could have been like, well, he wasn't a good father, so I have an excuse to be a bad father, or just never be a father at all because I don't know how. Right. Or I could have taken the path that I did, or the mindset that I did, and say, you know what? He's the reason that I have to be a good father.
Have to figure this out. Yeah.
So that plays right into, I know exactly what you're talking about when you say that, because I could have chosen the other way. I could have chosen the fact that, I have an excuse to be a bad father. I was never taught how to be one. So, right. That's, I can be a bad father or whatever. So I get it. It's definitely a real thing.
Yeah. And you, I mean, just to clarify, like you managed to figure out how to be a father to your children despite deployments, despite being moved all over the country, despite TDYs. And I mean, a lot of military folks lose more time with their family to TDYs than they do to deployments, Yep. And for those who don't know, TDYs are like training opportunities where you get sent to whatever place to do, 6 weeks of training here or 12 weeks of training here. You're still away from your family. You're not deployed into a combat situation, but you're not home,
No.
and like I said, you managed to parent your kids despite those circumstances. It would have been easy, I think, for you to do what you said, to be like, well, I had an absent father, so I don't know how to do this, and I'm being sent all over the place. And so,
Good luck.
well, right, yeah. Wish you the best. But it takes effort, right? It takes intention,
Does.
to stay connected. Yeah.
Absolutely. So,
Okay. So we were talking a little bit before we started this, and you were saying, even though you're coming up on 20 years, which is for most people retirement time in the Army,
correct.
you're looking to hang out another couple of years, yes?
Yeah, because
Parenting.
yeah, my son Abraham, he's a sophomore in high school, and in order for him to not have a disrupted education by either coming with me somewhere wherever I retire to, or to move back with his mother, I'm going to, I won't say sacrifice, because I don't look at it as more like a sacrifice. I'm just going to continue my military career for another few years to allow him to have stability throughout high school and have one school for 4 years, and graduate with his friends and his wrestling team and everything. So I'm just going to stick it out for another couple of years, do station stability here, because the Army will let me stabilize because he's a high school age child. And then once he graduates, I'll drop those papers, and it'll be around 23, I think 23 years by the time I end up getting out. So
I'm noticing our time, and I want to be respectful of your time. Are there things that you hoped we would get to, or that you wanted to share today that you feel like we haven't?
No, I think my just based off of the structure of your podcast and of your page in general, I think the primary objective that I wanted to get out was talking about, because it's growth after. So I just wanted to share, my experience, because even if someone doesn't lose a child, it could be, recovering from drug addiction. It could be, losing a big job, and just, losing your whole family. There's so many things that are life altering that aren't necessarily as traumatic.
Yeah.
For my trauma isn't their trauma.
Right.
Like we were talking about earlier. Oh yeah, it doesn't have to be as big as this for it to still be, Becca's home, for it to be traumatizing. So the same tools work regardless of the situation. So that's the biggest thing. What I wanted to do is to make sure people didn't look at my extreme as so unique that it couldn't work for them.
Yeah. And I think that's an important point. I'm a big advocate of the saying, everybody's pain matters.
Absolutely.
Right. If you're sitting in the waiting room at the doctor, or in the emergency room or something, certainly somebody who's at risk of bleeding to death will get immediate attention. That's true, right? Because they're in crisis and they need triage. But generally speaking, we don't go around the waiting room of the doctor's office and ask each person why they're there, and then determine who deserves to go in and see the doctor based on how sick they are, right?
Yeah.
Everybody deserves to be well. And so whatever's ailing you requires treatment, and everybody waits their turn, and then everybody gets the treatment, hopefully, that they need. And so I think that's a really important point. What you reminded me of just now is there's this idea. I mean, if you want to get academic about it and like go into, write a paper or something, it's a theory called life course theory. But what life course theory says, and to me, this is a really useful metaphor, is it says we can look at people's lives as a series of what they call transitions and trajectories.
Okay.
This theory was originally developed to try to understand why kids get into crime, right? Why they become juvenile delinquents, if you will. And the idea is transition. So you're born into whatever kind of household you're born into, in whatever neighborhood, with whatever family, and that sets you on a certain trajectory. And then at some point in your life, you have a transition. And that transition is basically any impactful occurrence. It could be, the birth of another sibling. It could be moving to a new town. It could be the death of a loved one. It could be meeting somebody who has a big influence on your life, meeting a friend who has either a positive or negative influence in some way. But that's a transition. And what happens is almost like a pinball, right? If you ever play pinball.
Anyways, good.
So it's almost like a pinball, right? Like if you play pinball, the ball is on a certain trajectory until it hits something, and that changes the trajectory. And then it hits something else, and that changes the trajectory. And so our lives are a little like that. We're on a certain trajectory until we encounter some sort of event or relationship or thing that adjusts our trajectory. And the way I view it is we can either, like the pinball, we can either have a hands-off approach and these things just put our trajectory in whatever direction they put them, or we can roll up our sleeves and adjust that trajectory the way we want it to go. And so hey, Becca, happy birthday.
Thank you.
So for anybody who's listening or watching right now, I've contacted Becca, and we're going to have her on a future episode to tell her story as well. But today is her birthday, so everybody, good thoughts and happy birthday.
Thanks. Good to see you.
You too. You too. Miss you guys.
Miss you too.
So we were just getting ready to wrap up, and I'll let you have your husband back.
Thank you.
Ruben, I wanted to thank you for coming on. Is really, I know you wouldn't say this, but courageous for you to come on and share such a heart-wrenching story, and allow yourself to be an example for other people who might be in need. And so I'm grateful for that, and I appreciate you. And I also appreciate you for your service and your military career. So thank you for serving.
I appreciate you having me on. Appreciate you listening. And if even one person can alter their trajectory, then it's worth it.
Yeah.
One person takes one thing from this, it's worth it.
I totally agree. I couldn't agree more. What I normally do, Ruben, when I have people on who don't have their own sort of, if they're not professional helpers, right? If they don't have their own sort of social media pages geared toward this kind of thing, is I usually say that if anybody has questions or comments or wants to get in touch with you about anything in this podcast, that they can just message me through the Facebook pages or whatever, and I will convey the messages to you. Does that way you don't have to give out a personal email or anything like that?
Okay, that's great. Perfect.
All right. So for those folks who are either listening or watching this podcast, I want to say thank you so much for investing your time. Please feel free to like, comment, and share the podcast. Podcast is available on Spotify, on Apple Podcasts, and on Google Podcasts. The video version is on YouTube, and the YouTube page is Growth and Thriving LLC. So please check us out there. For those who are interested, I also I have some Facebook communities. There's Growth and Thriving After Trauma, Thriving Fathers, Parenting After Trauma, and Leadership Skills for Survivors. Please feel free to join those groups and participate in those. I'm always really happy with the sort of interactive community we have in those. They're really energetic groups, not by my doing, but by the people who are in it. So please feel free to join those groups and participate. And last but not least, I have started a blog, which has a different theme from this podcast. It's a little more humorous. I swear a lot in it, but it's a little funnier, but it's sort of the same theme. I use my life and some of my mistakes and my decisions as a lens through which I look at lessons learned and how to how to live, hopefully figure it out in some kind of way. The name of the blog is What the Fuck Am I Doing? And, and
Yeah.
the website is
Thumbs up
www.
parenthood.
Yeah, right. Exactly. And the website is www.whatthefkamidoing.com. Please feel free to go on there, subscribe, read, share, comment. I always respond to comments. And so once again, thank you everybody so much. Happy birthday, Becca.
Thank you.
This for another moment is Dr. Jerry Sunshine Novak signing off. And I'll say just keep growing until you're thriving. Thanks, Ruben.
Thank you.